Hello, and welcome to the Classical Wisdom Weekly course on Essential Greeks. Today we're going to look at the world of theatre, and in particular the most divisive and controversial tragedian, Euripides. For the ancient Athenians, theatre was a vitally important aspect to their cultural, moral, and religious life. The theatre was a place to socialize, to learn, to be entertained, and to give pleasant worship to the god Dionysus. So important was it that the Great Dionysia, a theatrical festival held around the beginning of April, was second in importance on the religious calendar only to the Panathenaea, the annual festival dedicated to the city's protectress, Athena. The Panathenaea was sacred and of supreme importance, but it was also a source of entertainment in the shape of athletic contests and poetry readings. To worship Dionysus at the Great Dionysia, or the lesser festival, the Lenaea, all you needed was to settle down with a glass of wine and enjoy the earliest, and indeed some of the finest theatre Western civilization had ever produced. The mark of greatness in these plays is evidenced by the fact that they are still with us, some 2,500 years after they were first performed. Regrettably, the vast majority of both Greek tragedy and comedy is now lost to the ages. We do, however, have 4 shining lights of theatrical writers who, between them, wrote over 300 plays, of which 44 still remain. These men are Aeschylus, Sophocles, the comedian Aristophanes, and finally, Euripides. And today, it is Euripides, that dark tragedian, with whom we are primarily concerned. Here we turn briefly to Aristophanes, a contemporary playwright, as there is really no way of discussing Euripides without also talking about his comedic peer. The following excerpt comes from Aristophanes' masterpiece, The Frogs, performed in 405 BC, just 1 year after the death of Euripides. In the following excerpt, we hear Aeacus and Xanthias discussing which deceased playwright has the honor of sitting by Pluto's side in the underworld.
There's a custom here with all the crafts, the good and noble crafts, that the chief master in each art shall have his dinner in the assembly hall and sit by Pluto's side, until another comes, more wise than he in the same art. Then must the first give way.
And how has this disturbed our Aeschylus?
'Twas he that occupied the tragic chair, as in his craft the noblest.
Who does now?
Euripides came down. He kept flourishing off before the highwaymen, thieves, burglars, parricides. These form our mob in Hades. Till with listening to his twists and turns, and pleas and counterpleas, they went mad on the man, and hailed him first and wisest. Elate with this, he claimed the tragic chair where Aeschylus was seated.
Such was the legacy of Euripides, and not a legacy born from centuries of detailed rereading and analysis, but one which the man himself would have been aware he was leaving. This talk of Euripides pleasing thieves, highwaymen, and assorted scoundrels of Athens and the surrounding Attica was damning with the faintest of praise. Aristophanes was referring to Euripides' love of the low, the base, rather than the lofty and regal, which was more a feature of the earlier works of Aeschylus. It is thanks to Aristophanes, the undisputed master of old comedy, that we have much of the colour we do about Euripides. And what is known of his life? Well, sources indicate he was born around 480 BC and was a native of the island of Salamis. Although he became a prominent figure in Athenian city life, he returned to the island for solitude in order to compose his plays. Not so strange in itself, you might think, and you'd be quite right, but it was his choice of office which caught the imagination. A lone figure, swaddled in rags, sitting secluded in a dank cave bent over his papyrus, a whittled reed in his hand dipping rhythmically into the pod of octopus ink, before adding a couple of urgent scratches to his script. His bushy white beard stained off-center at the lower lip, evidence of habitual pen-chewing, but his mind is stained far more indelibly with images of gods, war, warriors, adultery, incest, exile, blasphemy, damnation, infanticide, patricide, matricide, human sacrifice, and worst of all, foreigners. These are the ideas, the dark and evil components of Greek tragedy that Euripides believes are too stock, too trite, too bedtime story for the citizens of Athens. Well, this is the reputation, perhaps accurate, perhaps inspired by Aristophanes, we don't know, but we've no reason to believe that the man who produced, directed, and wrote the Bacchae, Hippolytus, Medea, and Elektra really was the tortured recluse, the artistic oddball. It satisfies our own sense of drama to think that he was, because instead of merely putting on a new spin for traditional Greek myths, he always managed to find an even more shocking way to deliver a tired and trusted tale. He could make heroes devils and devils heroes, and all without forcing the audience to break their mental stride. His reclusiveness and mystery are accentuated by the fact that, late in life, Euripides supposedly left Athens for Macedon in self-imposed exile. Why did he go? Some think he was just frustrated with the Athenian theatre-going public who didn't appreciate his art. However, it is just as likely that he left for a lucrative retirement, where his talents were rewarded not only with money, but also with praise and status. Unfortunately for him, Euripides would only achieve this praise and status posthumously. Aristotle, who was himself part of the Athenian intellectual diaspora to Macedon, where he became the tutor of Alexander the Great, wrote about Euripides in his treatise on literary theory, the Poetics. The hard-to-please Aristotle offers high praise to Euripides on a number of occasions. In the following excerpts, Aristotle lauds the dramatist's tragic quality, compares him favorably to his fellow tragedian Sophocles, and commends his subject matter and love of pathos.
Euripides, faulty though he may be in the general management of his subject, yet is felt to be the most tragic of the poets. He drew men as they ought to be, Euripides as they are. Now, the best tragedies are founded on the story of a few houses, on the fortunes of Alcmaeon, Oedipus, Orestes, Meleager, Thyestes, Telephus, and those others who have done or suffered something terrible. A tragedy, then, to be perfect according to the rules of art, should be of this construction. Hence they are in error who censure Euripides just because he follows this principle in his plays, many of which end unhappily.
Aristotle could have written his Poetics as early as 350 BC, meaning only 55 years had elapsed between the image of Euripides the recluse, Euripides the tormented, Euripides the punchline, and this Euripides, the Euripides of Aristotle. To what do we owe this change exactly? Well, the more pertinent question is, was there ever really a change at all? As we touched on before, it was Aristophanes who provided much of the ammunition which was fired at Euripides. But we must bear in mind that Aristophanes was not a biographer, he was a comedian. And as a comedian, he created a comic alter ego for Euripides. Kernels of truth were stretched and accentuated to seemingly ridiculous extremes, and Euripides was not merely referenced, but appeared directly as a character in several plays. One common joke was that Euripides' wife was having an affair with his lodger, who also happened to collaborate with Euripides in writing some of his plays. Here we again turn to Aristophanes' The Frogs, and a conversation between Euripides, his predecessor Aeschylus, and the god of theatre, Dionysus.
No one can say that I have ever put an erotic female into any play of mine.
How could you? You've never even met one.
And thank heaven for that. Whereas you and your household have only too much experience of Aphrodite, if I remember rightly. She was too much for you in the end.
He's got you there, Euripides. See what happened in your own home when you made other men's wives behave like that on the stage?
Another running gag was that this cuckolding created in Euripides such bitterness that many of his plays ended up propounding a theme of misogyny. The entire plot of Aristophanes, the Poet and the Women, concerns the revenge the women of Athens plan to take on Euripides for such slurs. One such woman says, "I have long been pained to see us women insulted by this Euripides." And whilst the women are in the secret congress, another comments, "The principal business here shall be the punishment to inflict upon Euripides for the insults which he has loaded upon us. Another more serious and possibly damning joke was that, like his contemporary Socrates, Euripides subverted the moral order of the day, was an atheist and blasphemous towards the gods. Again, we turn to the frogs for our source, wherein we witness the difference between the supposed piety in Aeschylus, but lacking in Euripides.
Ye two, put up your prayers before ye start.
Demeter, mistress, nourisher of my soul, O make me worthy of thy mystic rites.
Now put on incense, you.
Excuse me, no, my vows are paid to other gods than these. Aristophanes also accuses Euripides of making tragedy less lofty. In other words, whilst Aeschylus uses kings, gods, and heroes as characters, Euripides uses beggars, cripples, and the working classes. And even when portraying kings, they are clad in rags and slovenly. More insulting, but least credible of all Aristophanes' comical accusations, was the joke that Euripides' mother sold cabbages in the Athenian agora. We see evidence of both these from the mouth of Dicaeopolis in the Acharnians. Dicaeopolis has gone round to the house of his neighbour, Euripides, seemingly in order to ask for the writer's help with a speech he is composing.
You perch aloft to compose tragedies, when you might just as well do them on the ground. No wonder you introduce cripples on the stage. And why do you dress in these miserable tragic rags? No wonder your heroes are beggars. But Euripides, on my knees I beseech you, give me the tatters of some old piece, for I have to treat the chorus to a long speech, and if I do it badly, it is all over with me. Euripides, my excellent Euripides, my dear little Euripides, may I die if I ask you again for the smallest present. Only one, the last, absolutely the last. Give me some of the cabbage your mother left you in her will.
The effect of these jokes could have been to drive Euripides to distraction, perhaps even drive him out of Athens. But more likely, the effect was what Aristophanes would surely have hoped for, to make the audience laugh. Indeed, Aristophanes had been humiliating the politicians of Athens for years, mercilessly making fun of them and characterizing them, half-witted, bloodthirsty, as fools. However, his lampooning of them, like of Euripides, was primarily about laughs and seemed to do little to diminish their popularity or prevent their re-election. It is almost impossible to imagine that Euripides was from anything other than a high-class family and that he enjoyed a fine education. Whether or not his wife was playing away, we don't know for sure, but anybody who closely studied his plays would find it hard to conclude that he was a misogynist. In fact, even more so than his great rivals Aeschylus and Sophocles, Euripides treats his female characters with great sensitivity and sympathy, as well as portraying them as independent and intelligent. Moreover, it is quite likely that Euripides would have actually been in the audience when some of Aristophanes' zingers landed, making the impact of the joke twofold. First, as the audience appreciated what the actor said, then second, as they turned as one to the embarrassed, angry, or perhaps laughing Euripides. One area where Aristophanes did not poke fun at Euripides was in that of peace and war. The 5th century BC was a time of relentless fighting for Athens, and both men used their art as a medium to criticize either politicians or the very nature of war itself. Indeed, it's possible one reason Euripides was not a man appreciated in his own time was because of his unwillingness to slap a "support the troops" sticker on the front of his programs. Whilst accusations he was a pacifist were perhaps a little wide of the mark, both he and Aristophanes stood out as men who used their talents to campaign against the involvement of Athens in expensive, devastating, and pointless military campaigns. Much as Euripides' attempts to win favor with the public were to no avail, his efforts to influence popular opinion on foreign policy matters were equally fruitless. 2 years after his death, Athens fell to the Spartans. The cradle of democracy never recovered its status as the leading light of Western civilization. Thus, Euripides' legacy is a theatrical, not a political one. He changed theatre from a vehicle for education and moralizing to one of doubt and introspection. Whilst it was his complexities, his ambiguities, and his lack of conformity that brought him up against such resistance in his own time, it is perhaps those same qualities that keep him relevant and endear him to so many today. But what precisely is it about these complexities that keep modern audiences coming back for more? To understand this, we need to get under the skin of the text. The Medea, the ultimate tale of the fury of a woman scorned, is Euripides' earliest true surviving tragedy. Performed in 431 BC, it tells the tale of Jason in his post-Argonaut phase and his exotic and dangerous wife, Medea. The traditional tale has Jason abandon Medea in order to marry Glaus, the daughter of King Creon of Corinth. Consequently, Medea kills both bride and father before fleeing the city. In revenge, the locals murder her and Jason's 2 children. This original story is shocking enough, no doubt, but the innovation that Euripides introduced would have chilled his audiences to the bone. Medea's words say it all.
My friends, I have decided to act, and at once. I will kill the children and then quit this land. I will not delay and so deliver them to other hands to spill their blood more eagerly.
And the audience was no doubt chilled. The Medea limped in lamely during that year's Great Dionysia, finishing in a poor 3rd place. However, this was not down to the innovation in itself. It was perfectly acceptable for a playwright to quite significantly change the plot of a well-known story. Think of something as renowned to us as Romeo and Juliet. In ancient Greece, these famous stories could have had characters added or deleted, and had the plot significantly altered without causing any undue comment. Despite this tolerance for radical creativity, it seems that the idea of 2 Greek children being butchered by their wild, foreign mother was too much for the Athenian audience to stomach. Euripides had more luck with his production of Hippolytus in 428 BC. The story of the Athenian queen Phaedra falling in love with her son-in-law Hippolytus was dealt with twice by Euripides. The earlier account is no longer with us, but was said to depict Phaedra as a wanton seductress who does everything she can to seduce her husband's celibate son. This incarnation received a similar reception as the Medea, the Athenian audience not taking kindly to the idea of such aggressive and inappropriate behavior. The later version came 3 years after the Medea and was far more subtle, psychological, and popular. It won Euripides one of his 5 first prizes at the Great Dionysia. In this incarnation, Phaedra is still in love with Hippolytus, and as she considers her only alternative is to pine away to nothingness in love-lorn misery, she opts to take her own life. In her suicide note, she unjustly accuses Hippolytus of rape. The results are predictable and tragic. Hippolytus ends up exiled, disowned, disgraced, and of course, deceased. However, there is much ambiguity as to who is at fault. Is it Phaedra for her weakness and cruelty? Hippolytus for his celibacy, his disrespect of the love goddess Aphrodite? Or the father of the house, Theseus, for neglecting to control his wife and failing to understand or trust his son? Or perhaps it is the gods themselves who are the problem. Is all this the fault of the love goddess, Aphrodite, referred to here as the Cyprian?
As for your Cyprian, she's not mine. Good riddance!
Well, I'll make my prayers to your statue, Lady Cypris, speaking as a slave should, for we shouldn't imitate young folk when this is what's in their heads. Forgiveness is what we need. If someone in the heat of youth says foolish things about you, pretend not to hear him. Gods should be wiser than men.
Gods should be wiser than men. But in Hippolytus, they were not. Perhaps here Aristophanes has some real evidence with which to accuse Euripides of blasphemy. If Euripides was indeed considered a blasphemer, then living in Macedon was probably a very smart move, considering back in Athens, Socrates was condemned to death for impiety in 399 BC. But where can we see the real mark of difference between the Greek tragedians? Well, it comes in the story of their treatment of Elektra. The torrid tale starts with the father, the famous hero of the Trojan War, Agamemnon, who sacrificed his daughter for good wind to set sail. On his return, he was murdered by his wife, Clytemnestra, who didn't take well to her daughter's death. Enter Elektra and her brother Orestes, who then wrought vengeance on their mother, Clytemnestra, and her lover, Aegisthus. Elektra herself was a playwright's dream, wronged, bitter, wrathful, erudite, hysterical, pathological, dangerous, righteous, and female. This may well be the reason why we have full, extant plays about her from Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Whilst the Elektra character in Aeschylus is provocative, hostile, and vengeful, she is also passive, leaving the killing to her brother Orestes. Sophocles develops her into a sickening figure, who is indulging in a quasi-incestuous relationship with her dead father. But Euripides, the enfant terrible, could not resist going a step further. What could possibly be a step further than allusions to incest? Well, for this audience, it was having Elektra commit the matricide herself. And so while Orestes averted his gaze, Elektra stood firm and watched the geyser of blood erupting from her mother's neck. She was the vehicle for Clytemnestra's destruction. Cold, calculating, and horrific, she was every bit the terrifying, dangerous female that Euripides had previously made Medea into. And although we don't know how this incarnation of Elektra fared at the Dionysia, if the audience's reaction to the formidable Medea and Euripides' earlier incarnation of the lustful Phaedra are anything to go by, then we can assume it wasn't wholly favorable. These extreme and commanding female figures, with their intriguing and complex psyches, did not seem to be the stuff on which success was built for an Athenian playwright, at least not in the 5th century BC. Also, we see in the Elektra that the only truly positive character is Elektra's peasant husband. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that in a society of slave owners, socially inferior characters were not well received. Perhaps in the same way, patriarchal Athens may have abhorred the powerful representations Euripides gave to some of his female characters. If so, there is a strong irony that anyone could accuse Euripides of being misogynistic. Fascinated by the social and psychological roles of gender? No doubt, but hardly a woman-hater. Thus we come to our and Euripides' final play, penned just before his death and performed posthumously in 405 BC. It was, of course, the Bacchae. The Bacchae, the murderous Maenads, were the followers of Dionysus, and the play focuses heavily on the mystery cult of the god. To write a play featuring a mystery religion was a bold move by Euripides, as, unlike the popular heroic myths which were well known to all, the mysteries were, by their very nature, secretive to the uninitiated. There would, however, have been plenty of gossip and speculation as to the details of the cult, which would have given even an ignorant viewer a peek through the shroud of secrecy that hung over the proceedings. Despite a straightforward plot, this is probably the least easy of Euripides' extant plays to analyze. Written in Macedon, directed by his son, and performed at the Great Dionysia, the Bacchae is a simple tale riddled with ambiguity. Pentheus, king of Thebes, has banned all worship of his cousin Dionysus. Dionysus decides to wreak revenge. He sends the women of the city mad with devotion and forces them out into the glens of Mount Cithaeron. These women are now his acolytes, his Bacchae. Pentheus orders their arrest and the execution of the effeminate foreigner who is exciting them, not realizing that this is actually Dionysus in disguise. Dionysus is arrested, escapes, and then escorts a brainwashed and transvestitized Pentheus into the countryside to watch the sexual exploits of the women. However, far from getting his free peep show, Pentheus is torn limb from limb by the revelers led by his crazed mother, Agave. Agave brings the head of Pentheus back to the city, and as the mania of the Bacchic frenzy relents, repercussions and regret begin to take hold. So what can we take away from this deadly drama of blood and blasphemy? Well, despite many considering this to be Euripides' magnum opus, there is little consensus about the message beyond the madness. One interpretation is that this is a deathbed repentance of an old man, recounting all his years of impiety. However, this is hard to believe, as Dionysus is portrayed as a creature of horror, violence, and cruelty, not content with justice, but desirous to carry out torture and humiliation. We witness evidence of this when the citizens of Thebes see their addled king being marched out of the city, emasculated in women's garb. On his return, all that is left is a severed head clutched in the hands of his frenzied mother, who at this moment is cruelly brought back to reality.
Oh, what am I looking at? What am I holding?
Look at it steadily and understand more clearly.
I see. Oh gods, what horror! What torture!
Does this seem to you like a lion?
No. It is Pentheus' head I hold in my accursed hand.
And whilst there is a call for piety, it feels more born of pragmatism rather than of true belief. As the sage old grandfather Cadmus puts it, mortals must not make light of gods. I would never do so. Dionysus, god of joy, has been just, but too cruel. These words of Cadmus are given extra weight as he, along with Tiresias, is the only noble and wise character in the play. Thus, the emphasis is not on hubris or blasphemy, but on the folly of upsetting a powerful enemy, which is tantamount to willful abandonment of wisdom. Did Euripides believe it was this that was at the root of social and political problems of Athens? This play was written far away from the bereaved, bankrupt, and exhausted world of Athens, at a time when the Peloponnesian War was fast being lost. Whether Euripides was a bitter exile or a content expatriate, we cannot know, but his distance, together with his advanced age, may have given him greater urgency and freedom. So was the play a warning to the city? On the surface, a warning from Euripides to be pious seems disingenuous and inconsistent, but perhaps that was what it was. Euripides knew only too well that most Athenians were, outwardly at least, extremely devout. Is he therefore using religion to manipulate the believers? In doing so, trying to highlight the folly of war, trying to bring an end to the carnage? It is hard to say, but it is certainly unusual for a god, a true god, not a Heracles demigod figure, to dominate the action. Tragedy is filled with deities, but they are usually behind the scenes, pulling the strings, causing or resolving problems out of mortal control, and usually only punishing and not, like Dionysus, also committing sin. Religious and violence are clearly important aspects of the Bacchae. However, it is difficult to understand if the former is being used to explain, excuse, or warn against the latter. We certainly see extreme and brutal violence in Pentheus' punishment, a punishment we are not sympathetic to. He preciously states he wants to hunt the Maenads, and has desires to execute the effeminate foreigner by stoning, hanging, or beheading. Then Tiresias says to Pentheus that it is not force that governs human affairs. With these words, is Euripides emphasizing peace, piety, or wisdom? Or are the three interchangeable, each impossible to achieve without the others? Euripides knows he won't be around forever. He'll no longer be there to tell people how to think, to point out the error of their ways. If he can persuade his estranged countrymen to think logically, calmly, peacefully, then perhaps he can die with some hope for Athens. More superficially, does Euripides think Athenians are taking life too seriously? The 5th century is a time of serious thought, of democracy, logic, laws, expansion, and building. Perhaps Euripides, reflecting from his position of remote tranquility, thinks everyone should do what feels good, more like Dionysus. Our wise Tiresias even says that the cure for the weariness of life is for men to have their fill of wine. Or simply, subtly, and very sadly, the play might be an introspective look at the life of a lonely expatriate, a man who misses the Acropolis and agoras of Athens. Were the words of the innocent Cadmus really those of our ancient exile?
What utter misery and horror has overtaken us all? In my old age, I must leave my home and travel to strange lands.
A belated adoption of religion, a drive for peace, the plea of an educated man desperate for his fellow citizens to think, the lament of a heartbroken exile who misses his homeland, or simply an encouragement for us to dance, drink, and be merry. Whichever way, the overriding conclusion to be drawn from the Bacchae is that this is a truly fascinating piece of theatre from the mind of an undeniably extraordinary individual. The Bacchae won a dead Euripides only the first prize of his lengthy career. Although he was never truly esteemed in his own time, perhaps then, just 1 year after his death, the Athenian public began to realize what they had lost. They had lost someone who, despite poor showings in competition, despite public ridicule, despite having his social and political ideas attacked or ignored, despite quite possibly being forced into exile, he still kept going. He kept writing. He kept doing everything he could to make Athens a better place. Euripides the patriot, the reformer, the misogynist, the feminist, the blasphemer, the psychologist. Think of him how you will. But it is Euripides the artist to whom we are indebted. The artist who, though regrettably not appreciated in his own time, we are lucky enough to appreciate in ours.